This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is produced in conjunction with the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. Here now are the hosts of Compendium, Steve Stefano and Christine Gilbert. Hi everyone, welcome back to Compendium. As always, I'm Christine Gilbert, joined here with my co-host Steve Stefano.
Hi Christine, how are you?
Good. So today's podcast is super interesting. We're talking a little bit about interdisciplinary research, how weather impacts how we understand climate change, as well as the communication inherent therein.
Yeah, and I think that sitting down with a meteorologist who is now communication trained gives us a little bit of a different perspective on how science and communication can overlap with one another. And that's what we get with Adam Rainear, our doctoral dissertation candidate who sat down with us for this episode.
So without further ado, here's Adam Rainear.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Steve Stefano here with my co-host Christine Gilbert, and our guest today is a senior graduate student just about to finish and defend his dissertation. Please welcome Adam Rainear.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So Adam, as we do with every scholar that we bring onto Compendium, we're going to ask with the very first question, which is, where were you born?
Where was I born? I was born in a small town in South Jersey called Woodbury, New Jersey, which is like 30 minutes from where I grew up.
Okay, and from Woodbury, New Jersey, you progressed at some point in your early academic career to a moment where you saw communication as a field, and you said, I think I kind of might want to do this. What was that like?
It was interesting. It's an interesting story to tell people because it was actually Hurricane Sandy that really shifted my gears from journalism specifically and meteorology, obviously, to more about the societal impact side of things and understanding how do our messages get received in times of crises? Do people act on the messages we send out in times of weather disasters and things like that? So seeing it firsthand in my home state for the first time and not seeing it through cable channels or the Weather Channel or media organizations or coverage that way was very visceral and very different. So it just kind of shifted my focus. I really wanted to be a TV meteorologist for most of my time during undergrad until basically about Christmas time junior year. So it was a little late in the game to kind of switch my focus and change paths, I guess, but they were similar enough that I made it work. So I guess junior year at Rutgers was my time.
So it's interesting because it's, when you think about meteorology, obviously a complicated science field with a media component. You had a journalism background as well. And in communication, in a way, you almost zoomed out and started looking at the entire process of, what is the science behind what's happening here? How do we understand it? How can we better understand it? How can we better be prepared to deal with it? And what are the processes that govern that? So what was that transition like from, sort of the hard science and meteorology and the practice and practicality of journalism into this more blend of social science and application that is communication?
Yeah, I actually would even argue that the switch from journalism to communication was a little more challenging to grasp than the one from meteorology to journalism, because embedded within meteorology there's a pretty distinct physical side and a pretty distinct social component or social side of things. So being able to see that already through the field of meteorology wasn't that different when I jumped into communication, but journalism is so hands-on, practical skills, very writing oriented, or in today's world writing for online or putting together little graphics and things like that. And so switching from that aspect to more theoretical and discussing larger groups of people or populations at large or something like that was kind of different to grapple with and a little bit different to understand. But having some of the methods and statistics backgrounds definitely helped made the data easier to understand, but understanding the concepts might have been a little trickier.
That's kind of an interesting transition that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about. So you mentioned previously that you went to Rutgers for your undergrad. And you got 2 bachelor's degrees while you were there. So that transition, it sounds like in your junior year, allowed you to do that. So essentially, did you make up the credits in 1 year in communication?
Sort of. So you had to take Comm 101, which was the equivalent of Comm 1000 at Rutgers, and then Comm 102, which is basically like 1300 at Rutgers. And once you passed those 2 classes, you could quote unquote apply to the journalism school or the communication school and then become an official major. So I think I did that alongside of like my later half of my sophomore year, because I knew I wanted to be on TV, and so many of those jobs required you to be a journalist during the week and the TV meteorologist on the weekend or something like that. So I figured that skill set would really be beneficial no matter what I did. But once I started to do that and take those classes and then coupled it with like everything that happened in my junior year with Sandy and just kind of reevaluating grad school and jobs and all of that, it really made me to think, it's not so much the journalism and being on TV that I want to do, but that actual shift to understanding society and the messages and things like that.
So that connection with people is what you were more interested in.
Yeah, definitely.
So can you tell us a little bit about the transition between Rutgers and the University of Connecticut? How was it that you found yourself to be here? I know you're an excellent student, so you likely had a lot of options. How did you decide that UConn was where you wanted to be?
Yeah, I always joke with the incoming students that UConn was last of my choices for grad school. It was 6 out of 6 on the list, but it was really mainly because I didn't know a lot about the school going into it. I didn't know a lot about the program going into it, and I was interested in more science-heavy or risk-heavy communication programs at first. But the more I started to think about it and look and visit the programs and see, who's working in what kind of area, I really realized that I had a lot of the science background that I might need to bring to the table, and I didn't have the communication background. I didn't have the true social science theory background and understanding agenda setting versus use and graphs versus cultivation, and what are the differences and how can we apply those to science. So I think getting a general comm degree was more interesting and appealing to me because I didn't have that background. That I could probably research a lot of science topics on my own because I'm interested in it. I read books. I'm passionate about it, so on and so forth. But understanding communication is a whole new field. It's something I've never really dove into aside from just writing articles journalistically, I guess. So being able to kind of make that jump or make that transition wasn't as bad. It was pretty decent, and I enjoyed the path that I took to get where I am today. Not everybody always says that. They don't always suggest it like, oh, I wish I stayed in this field, or I wish I took this major, or this and that. But switching fields was really enjoyable, and I definitely encourage students to, think about that rather than maybe getting another major in their field, but see what other fields relate to what you're doing and what you already know, and how you can kind of make yourself maybe more wide appealing to a variety of people.
Yeah, I think for communication, for a lot of that mirrors the experience of a lot of students who didn't necessarily start as communication, but come to COM 1000 or COM 1100 and say, this is interesting. This is something I actually might want to study. So I know that you haven't finished technically, quote unquote,
Yes.
But for all intents and purposes, you have. Have there been any points in your transition or in your graduate school career where you've really questioned what you're doing or thought maybe I do want to be on television? And I know that you still go to the annual conference. So maybe were there any points in that, or has it been really smooth sailing the entire time?
Oh, yeah. There were plenty of times I've second-guessed myself and second-guessed the decision. Over the last 6 months I've done it, but more so during the master's. I think when I was first getting here in the first year or two before I actually got my master's and was on the quote-unquote path to the PhD, we'll say, there were job offers that I actually received out there that I was interested in taking, and they were closer to home. They were in my area. They still would couple physical and social science together. So that was a weird battle because you want to give something a fair chance when you first start, and obviously moving out of New Jersey for the first time in my life is going to be difficult, even though it's an hour or 2 hours away depending on where you are. So it was that battle of do I stick with this and push through even though I'm short term kind of unhappy or maybe not as happy as I could possibly be, or do I give up and take this job, or do I stick with something that maybe I'm not that happy in right now, but I feel like I'm doing well in and I could enjoy for a long period of time, and that's the path I ended up taking, and I don't regret it at all. I'm glad I made the decision. I'm sure it's easier to say when you're at the 4.5 year mark than when you're at the year 2 mark or something like that, but I definitely feel like it's complemented my skills well, and I've enjoyed teaching so much more than I could have expected coming in because I just had no teaching background or experience even whatsoever, and there aren't a lot of jobs where you get that component on top of doing research and outreach and service and things like that. So I definitely enjoy coupling the two together.
So, a lot of students who, take our courses or are exposed to our department have varying backgrounds. And they say, well, I've already got a career path. And then I think like yourself, they come around to the field of communication in a way. So you've got this meteorology background and a journalism, media studies background, and you come here to a program that's devoted almost entirely and practically entirely to communication. What did you notice that maybe was missing in your areas of interest where people maybe had knowledge gaps? And likewise, what did you pick up on that you said, if I hadn't come to a communication program, I would have never realized that or thought about this that way?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really nice, and not just to toot the horn of the program or anything like that, but the program here has been evolving over the 5 years I've been here, and you don't always see that somewhere when you're there for 4 or 5 years. Like, it's not that really long of a time period, relatively speaking. So being able to see some of that transition, not necessarily even just hiring people or focus areas, but just adding things like the production component or things that I can, help contribute to as a student, that's been a really beneficial experience. The main one being the production component, where I can help teach those classes and kind of use some of those skills I learned through a hands-on journalism degree to then translate it to the classes we teach here in the communication department that are a little more hands-on than some of our theory classes, and a little less about your multiple choice exams and a little bit more about taking these skills and being able to repeat and use them over and over. So that's definitely been something I didn't expect, and kind of filled in some of that teaching gap. It's been really enjoyable to work with other departments outside of the communication department here at UConn. I borrowed from geography, engineering. I've gone on multiple trips with a lot of different people from those areas just to really bring home that point of what I really believe in like true interdisciplinary research and like involving people that are outside of your area to then fill in gaps that you might not know about, you might not understand. And the biggest one I think people talk about is physical versus social science. And we often study people and sit in our silos and kind of investigate that. But when we're designing messages or experiments or ideas to investigate people, like, we sometimes leave out the engineers who actually handle the physical components, or the physical scientists who actually know what's going into that model, or how to kind of elaborate that uncertainty statistically rather than trying to put it into words. And that's something that we commonly do. So there have been some really interesting collaborations in areas I didn't expect to kind of pop up over these 4.5 or 5 years. And that's an artifact probably of being able to pick a large university, state school to go to as well, which has helped along the way.
I think it's wonderful that you mentioned that, because historically, this field of communication, we've made this argument over the decades and even centuries now that, hey, this is everything we do. And now I think we're starting to come around almost holistically to this idea that if communication is involved with everything, if communication affects everything, then we have to look at communication from a variety of contexts. So you talked about some application when it comes to multimedia and production. You talked about science and understanding different fields of science and understanding the different ways that different people look at problems. I think that's something we've really been trying to get towards, and it's scholars like you who are up and coming into the field that are bridging that gap, because they're bringing other backgrounds in and are creating better discourse and dialogue among people about what kinds of work can be done and what kinds of work, especially in the case of things like Hurricane Sandy, should be done. So with that, I want to transition towards your research, because we haven't talked too much about the specifics of it. We'll start with something you've been doing recently. Sometimes we like to throw a little bit of a curve. So you've had some robotic intervention in your research lately. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different robots, one being a Beam Plus and one being Pepper, who is kind of more of a humanoid robot than the Beam Plus per se.
Good old Pepper.
Yeah, and we've been able to kind of run a couple of experiments on them, looking at things like involvement, information retention, and some of the technological related variables as well, to see how people perceive both the technology that they're interacting with, whether it be a robot versus getting a message on an HD TV or through a video game system or something like that, and then as well as the actual content of the message. So like, do I become more involved with this message about school shooting, or do I become more involved with this message about some abstract environmental risk just because a robot is delivering it to me, or just because I saw it on the TV versus the robot condition? So just looking at some of those differences, both examining the message and its content to see how people might differ across either different conditions or different kind of things going on in the experiment, but also looking at that actual technological interaction. So removing the content of the message, who cares what the message is? Do people find this robot weird? Does it throw them off? Do people wave at it when they walk into the lab? All of those kind of things that we don't really think about till we start to interact with this technology kind of more and more, and it becomes quote unquote like normal in society.
So can you tell us a little bit, so from that, did you find any interesting differences with the robotic intervention?
Yeah, so one of the ones we did I thought was really interesting. We had people come into the lab and they sat by the windows essentially. And if you know anything about Arjona, there's lots of windows in the building. And what they would do is they would either receive a message from a robot, which was a quote unquote mock severe thunderstorm warning, or in other words, a fake severe thunderstorm, an artificial severe thunderstorm warning, from either the robot in the lab. So it would wheel up to a predetermined spot, deliver this quote like 1 minute message or something like that, and then wheel wheel back to wherever it belonged in the lab. Or we would have a confederate, a person working in the lab, deliver it verbally, reading off a piece of paper or reading off the cell phone. I forget how we did it. And one of the things we found that the more technologically savvy conditions were kind of ignoring the content of the message. They weren't remembering as much of the information about this specific thunderstorm risk, which is really interesting because the thunderstorm risk was very specific to the area. So it wasn't like we were pulling out random places or locations or things that students would be unfamiliar with. It was things like stores, Hartford, Mansfield, like words that you would be like, oh, it's 5 minutes down the road. That's right down the street. I should, think about what impact does this have? Is this real? What's the weather outside? Like all of the things that should kind of be going in your head. And we found that people just became what we assume is people became really distracted by the robot and how maybe technologically interesting it was, that they were so focused on that piece of technology they weren't listening to what the robot was actually saying to them. And I think that's really interesting because we always talk about there's this general blanket that media effects will increase maybe as our technology becomes more immersive or more new, I guess, novel, we'll say. But we also sometimes kind of remove the reality of how often we might use some of these platforms in those situations we study. So like there are some contexts that we examine these things in where it's probably not going to be practical in the next 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years to ever deliver a message using a robot that way or using VR that way or something like that. You hear this argument a lot with virtual reality because it's not that cost effective yet. So I think that's an interesting way that we can add both a reality component to it or a component that allows you to give the public some meaningful information from this. And I thought that was interesting because, assuming that, because I read it on the computer or my smartphone and not in the newspaper, I'm going to believe it more, might not actually be a good enough blanket statement, because if it's a robot or if it's VR and it's too immersive, maybe we're losing some of the actual message, and that's obviously problematic.
It makes me think of Turing tests and the uncanny valley and a lot of things that we maybe don't realize need to be considered before we throw a machine out there as the primary vessel of information. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so related to that, and it sounds like a fair amount of your research has been about kind of the audience effect. So how do people understand information? So I can't remember, it was 2 or 3 years ago when Winter Storm Nemo was coming in on Instagram and on Twitter. There were pictures of Nemo the fish, and he was coming with snow. Yeah. And so you recently won a top award for a paper that you published about hashtag what's in a name, about this new phenomenon of naming winter storms. So can you tell us a little bit about some of those effects on the audience and what the results have suggested about winter?
Yeah. So I went to an American Meteorological Society meeting, an AMS meeting, about 5 or so years ago, right after the Weather Channel started naming winter storms, I think for the first season. So it would have been, I believe, in 2011 or 2012. I forget which one. But and the people in the audience, the physical scientists, the social scientists, the meteorologists, climatologists, whoever is there at this meeting, were generally up in arms about this practice. Like there was a lot of debate. The line for the end of the presentation, the line was out the door to ask questions, and like all those things that we all fear going into our presentations. Here it was realized because it was controversial. People saw it as kind of like a marketing ploy. A marketing gimmick was the term that came up a lot from people, probably more so physical scientists, but people who weren't really well versed in marketing and maybe campaign kind of research. But I would argue it's probably been very effective because we haven't found any reason or justification for it causing any differences among whether we name storms or don't name storms, or whether we name them with these common European names that we're all familiar with, like Bill and Adam and Christine and Steve, versus like something that's more mythological or a name we might not hear in today's society as much compared to something that might have come up in the Roman era or whenever we use these names. So, if there's no actual differences there, I started to wonder, like, what are we actually arguing about? What are we squabbling about? It sounds to me like a lot of what is happening is we're arguing about maybe things that we aren't familiar with. So like marketing research and marketing literature, there's a lot of, there are journals dedicated to marketing research. There are degrees, PhDs that are dedicated strictly to marketing, advertising, campaign management, measuring campaign success, and things like that. And no one really brought any of that to the table in the discussion. They didn't bring it up. They didn't talk about it. They didn't do a literature review on like why these marketing practices may be effective for this strategy. And then we also know our literature about hashtags and how effective it is to organize information on Twitter specifically, but social media in general, and how that can make it easier maybe for people to find that information. So it's almost less so a question of does the audience draw different perceptions based off of the name, more of a question of does the audience find this useful, and can they find additional or more or the information they need specifically about this storm or their location because it's got a hashtag associated with it, or because you can click on the hashtag and then it brings you to the page only dedicated to winter storm information. So, I mean, there are other arguments that are embedded in here. Then you have to think about, well, where are they getting their messages from, and how is Twitter's algorithm sorting those messages, and what's seen first versus what's seen last? Is it the National Weather Service at the top, or is it Joe Schmo in his basement at the top and National Weather Service at the bottom because maybe Joe Schmo gets 100,000 more people? So, like, there are a lot of different questions that are embedded in this, but generally speaking, we haven't found any research to suggest it's a bad practice or it's a practice that's harming anybody. To really answer and get a smoking gun answer to the question, like, it would take a pretty involved, almost interactive study where people are actually like cycling through information or searching for information on a computer or a smartphone or something like that to follow like where they're going. But if we think, where does all of that research and that methodology come from? It's usually marketing. It's usually following people's eyes or following where they're clicking on the screen or something like that. So again, getting back to that physical social science connection we talked about in the beginning of this, bringing it together and understanding like where we might lack in a field versus where somebody else might be an expert, it's really important. And I think that's where we get at the best and most successful research. So I just thought it was a great case in point. Like I was just a master's student at the time. I was interested in the idea because I actually didn't think it was a terrible idea to start with. I thought it gets some bad raps because Winter Storm Janice, if you cover up the A, like, yes, it looks terrible on the screen when someone's standing in front of the A. Or Winter Storm Nemo is very easy to make a meme of, and like it just goes viral on the internet. So like maybe there were some holes shot in the bottom of the boat when thinking through the strategy, but to say it's a bad practice or strictly a marketing ploy without anything to back it up, not really a strong argument, I don't think.
It's almost like, again, you are a perfect example of that interdisciplinary nature and the things that we lose when we really are in our silo. So so that I think is such a great example of that research. And so more broadly, in terms of research that you're working on now, whether related to your dissertation or other things you're thinking about, are there any studies that you're working on that you've gotten some preliminary results potentially that are interesting or surprising, or that you're trying to work through and can't necessarily make sense of yet?
I wish I had a better answer, but not particularly, only because I haven't got, if I had any data from my dissertation yet, I'm launching it right now, but if I had any data from my dissertation yet, I'm sure there would be something interesting there I could talk about, but I'm just like the hair before data point. So that's that'll be the first data-driven project I'll dive into pretty hardcore in the next couple of weeks, because I've just taken a kind of a back seat on data-driven projects with doing exams, which require so much theory or so much methods argument specific to like what people are asking you, and then preparing the literature review for your dissertation. You know, there's not really a lot of data going into that. So I've kind of pulled back a little bit on the data, but I'm really excited to see where the dissertation project goes, because I think it gets at a question that hasn't directly been answered. It's only been indirectly looked at. So I'm just looking at television meteorologists and broadcasters to see if we draw any differences in perceptions of trust or credibility, or if we can remember any more or less information from the forecast based off of the meteorologist is male or female, Caucasian or African American. So strictly a racial difference and a sex-based difference. And I chose those two demographics specifically for race because they're the two most common employed television meteorologists, African American and Caucasian. And then sometimes in the Pacific Northwest, you'll get Pacific Islander or Asian American or things like that. But it's not a high enough percentage to draw out your experiment to make it essentially a larger study. And then male versus female, because we hear all of the arguments about like how television meteorologists are highly sexualized and they follow stereotypes that a lot of our other female media characters typically follow. And what kind of implications does this have for women who want to get into science, women who want to get one of those roles on television, and even broadcasters in general, maybe not necessarily on camera, but to have to deal with all the interactions that those people have to deal with behind the scenes. Like, it might just get tiring after a while. You might not want to read through all the social media content talking about a woman's looks or a woman's dress or somebody's hairline or something. Like, it just might get tiring after a while. So I think it has implications on the media field in general, specifically television. But I mean, social media has obviously woven in so many of these messages into like our normal kind of consumption of media in that area.
So, if you look at just the 3 studies or general areas of research that you're talking about, you're looking at this communication process at multiple levels. Okay, so you're looking at the medium, a robot versus a human. You're looking at the message, so renaming the winter storm. And now you're looking at the individual that delivers the message. So, we talk about this in our core communication courses, but this really permeates the entire field. Regardless of your area of focus, you have to consider all these different contextual factors that will affect how people react to, respond to, or what they understand from any given communication message. And maybe nowhere is that more true than in any aspect of science communication, particularly science communication that directly relates to people's health and safety, such as bad weather forecasts. So I want to transition a little bit away from your research, and I would be remiss not to talk a little bit about your teaching before we let you out of here. So you've been widely recognized by the university as an exceptional teacher. Your students rave about you. I can speak firsthand to that. Anything from your teaching experience, from your teaching career here at UConn that has really stood out to you, maybe particular courses or lessons or things that you've done or experiences that you've had that'll stick with you, some stuff that you've experienced personally?
Yeah, so I'm only 26, and it amazes me how much of a difference there is between my generation, quote unquote, and the students that I'm teaching every day. And I mean, there are some things that relate to dates. Like, for example, you might make a reference to an important event, like 9/11, for example, and then you realize, oh, my students were 1 or 2 or 3 or not even born yet or something like that. And you just think about how you don't realize it, I guess, as time passed, like how different these generations become. And even when we talk specifically about communication and media, the differences in usage patterns. Like, Facebook is very important with my era, our era, Steve's era, if it's any different than my era. And so, like,
no, it's the same.
Okay. And so, like, I just find it really interesting how, like, we can find a platform so interesting, yet people who are 3, 4, 5 years not that far and not that different from us totally disregard that platform, or they find it less credible, or they're not interested in anything on that platform, but they're interested in all of the others that some of us are, maybe using in an emerging fashion or have been using for a while, but don't see it as kind of like our quote unquote main platform, I guess you would say. And I think most of us in this room would probably say Facebook's probably the main platform, and we supplement it with Snapchat, Instagram, whatever else is going on. So I think that's really interesting. It's something I never would have expected coming into kind of teaching that generational difference to be so apparent so quick.
Last couple of questions. If you had one 50-minute lecture to come into COM 1000 and teach anything in the field of communication that you wanted to, what would it be?
Science and risk communication. Easy.
Okay. Elaborate.
The field of science communication is so broad, and we interact with it on so many different ways. So, for example, weather is my interest. I think it's really important because we interact with the weather every single day of our lives. We decide what to wear in the morning, you need your umbrella or not, how you approach driving for the day. Like, a lot of our decisions, we don't realize it are impacted by weather. But then there are others that are longer-term life decisions or even border with health. So, for example, the whole anti-vaxxing argument. So being able to actually bring some literacy to that argument, be able to find credible research and credible information about the argument as to whether or not I should do A or should do B, I think is really important. And science communication is really one of the main areas, since we get so much of our information from media today. Science communication is one of the areas where we can start to address some of that illiteracy that we have as a society, and how you can find information, or you can use this source or that source, or you can trust this government agency. And if we start with how you can use media in these kind of, COM 1000-esque classes or other classes similar to that, how you can use media to find your information, supplement what you know about a topic in science or health, and then go from there, I think is really important to society being able to make good decisions in the future. I mean, it's not just anti-vaccine is kind of the hot one now, but like GMOs was one talked about before that. We can talk about all the differences between energy types, so wind energy versus coal. Climate change is obviously a big one. I mean, some of these are so woven in with politics nowadays that we really have an extremely hard time approaching them from like a baseline 0 level without some bias on one side or the other. But I think that's an area that's really important. I mean, science is just going to become more prolific, more dominating in society because we're just becoming more and more technologically advanced. So I think that's important to be able to make literate decisions based off of that.
Yeah, I certainly think that would be useful. I mean, we talk a little bit about towards the end of the class about science communication, but that certainly from an expert would be, I think, an excellent lecture. So last question here is generally more specific to communication. If you have some, any advice you have for our students in regards to their academic pursuits?
Any advice? I really enjoyed the chances I've had both in grad school and in undergrad to take classes outside of your wheelhouse, totally outside of your area. Sometimes you're forced to, and like it doesn't always seem as enjoyable as it might be, or it's a broad gen ed requirement that sounds like it's in an area that might not be interesting to you or something like that. But I've found that some of those classes, like I took in undergrad, I took history of the Holocaust, and I just learned so much more specific to this era of World War II, which we learned a lot about in New Jersey in high school. We read Knight and all of the Anne Frank and all of the common books you kind of read, but you're missing a lot of the historical context and the other things going on in the world at that time that a class like this very easily brings in. And it's hard to maybe dedicate as much time to research or studying in that class because you have all of the other ones you're worried about, or writing a true, really good paper. But I think you just find yourself so fascinated in such a niche area or an interesting kind of area for the rest of your life just because you took, one class in it at some point in your life. And I think that's a really interesting and important skill. And it really just gets back to that whole idea of being interdisciplinary and, knowing a little bit about a lot of different topics while being well-versed in a topic or two. So I guess it makes sense that I kind of feel that way and enjoy those external classes as well.
Yeah, so don't be afraid of your interests.
Yes.
Make sure that that's something you engage with.
And find a way to play on them. I mean, a lot of those classes you don't realize really do get into your interests or into things you might be strong in, more so than you actually realize on the surface or from the title or what department it's taught in, for sure.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Don't be afraid.
Yes,
so this,
such easy advice.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So that's all we have for you. So I just want to thank you again, Adam Rainear, senior graduate student at the Department of Communication, my co-host, Professor Stefano, and all of you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
The views expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and their guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut or the UConn Department of Communication.